you've got to see behind the scenes there. We're all very calm on the surface, panicking underneath. My name's Cully, because I know there's a few people here that I know that are part of the Morphe Nomas network already, and a few people that haven't been here before. I'm an artist based in Dundee, and one of the people, I work for a charity called Morphe Arts, and one of the people behind Nomas Project, along with Owen, who's been chatting there as well. Owen's also an artist and is currently working in St Andrews on the religion Encyclopedia of Religion project. For those that don't know, Nomas projects consists of 5 office windows in Dundee, and the name it came from a Greek word. It means roaming in search of pasture, and for Owen and I, the idea of roaming in search of pasture resonated with us as human beings generally, but artists in particular, who are always looking for inspiration. And our aim has always been to offer an opportunity to investigate the role of art in society, to engage with ideas, to learn from the experiences of others, and really to try and be part of a relevant conversation in the arts in Dundee and beyond. And we're delighted this afternoon to be working with Vahid, who is an Iranian-born poet and artist. He's currently living in Dundee, but also in the final stages of completing a PhD at St Andrews University. And I met our previous artist, Shelby Scattergood, through the Transept group that's based in St Andrews, and I'm indebted to them again, and another friend, for being able to connect me to Vahid. I was introduced to Vahid not in person, but through his writing and drawings that had been shared on the group chat. And I took an interest in them at the time, even though I wasn't familiar with Vahid at all. And then my next encounter with him was through a YouTube interview he'd given as part of Juniper Gallery. And I think Beth's here from Juniper Gallery this afternoon. So really appreciated that interview as well. And I was captivated in the interview by Vahid's story of migration as an asylum seeker, and how he told his story in such a poetic way and without bitterness. He just spoke with such gentleness about that, traumatic experience in his life. And so I felt moved really to invite Vahid to share his story through the Nomas platform as well. So I was aware of Vahid's written work, but when we met in person for the first time, he brought with him a selection of sketchbooks that were filled with stunning pen and ink drawings. And most of the drawings were self-portraits. And so after some discussion, we agreed that Vahid's story could be shared in part through his poetry, but also through these studies of him at different stages in his life. So what we have in Vahid's exhibition that's called The Owner of the Fish is his first solo exhibition of drawings and poetry. So The Owner of the Fish takes its title from a chapter in Vahid's elegant, epic poem, Nassim's Testament, and I'm sure he's going to talk more about that. But the poem is a self-elegy through which the poet salvages himself from a violent migration. Vahid arrived in the UK in 2013 as an asylum seeker, where he faced the need to remake himself. And throughout different phases of his out-of-placeness. And that was, again, that phrase was something that really attracted me and Nomas projects, because we're always concerned about that idea of what is on the outer sort of boundaries, that things are not included. So out of placeness, as he talked about, just felt like a real opportunity for us to give him a place that was validating or supporting that finding of his place. And the poet has needed to re-identify, reintroduce himself as an asylum seeker, as a refugee, an émigré, a migrant, an expat, and so on, each word being the other's shadow. So it's worth noting as well that Vahid is the author of 2 volumes of poetry in Persian and a poetry pamphlet in English entitled Something the Colour of Pines on Fire. His writing has been anthologized in Britain and Germany, and several poems have appeared in exhibitions of text and image in the British Museum, NYU in Abu Dhabi, Heldenreise, Contemporary in Munich, and Fact, Liverpool. As always, with Nomas, there's going to be opportunity to ask questions. And if you have any questions throughout the talk, put them in the chat, and then we'll know that that's there, and we can open up those questions at the end. For anyone who has their volume still on, you can maybe go on to mute, just so there's no background noises. And that's really it. Hopefully this is going to work when we screen share. Fingers crossed. And let's introduce and give Vahid a warm welcome. Thanks, Vahid.
Okay. Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Thank you very much for making time and joining me for the finale of The Owner of the Fish. I am very grateful to Collie and Owen for making Noma's project's 5 Windows a space for my first solo exhibition, and for giving me an opportunity to reflect on acts and instances of self-portrayal and self-exhibitionism. Today, instead of a talk, I am going to deliver a soliloquy for the next 20 minutes or so, sharing pictures of my exhibited portraits and a few others that were not on display at Noma's projects. So my soliloquy. Are you sure you know all your face contours, that they are firmly there? Are you confident that you won't be caught off guard by a glimpse of your visage, its reflection in an unexpected mirror, or on a cold window on a night bus where you are more of a specter superimposed on the fleeing surfaces of the outside world? Your face is something new at every given moment, as everybody else's is, and you have never depicted an exact likeness of yourself, neither with your lines nor with your words. You have been conjuring up your multi-faced dark side in your self-portraits and lyrical poems for many years. In August 2013, you became a closer neighbor of your other side when that womb, that shipping container in which you and 6 other asylum seekers were sex shadows, released you on this island. Perhaps in the beginning, you appeared to the islanders as a silhouette which should be illuminated with facial features and other legible lines. At least that was how you felt when you realized that you didn't have an ID to prove your name. The void was there to be filled with stories you wished to tell or your new milieu wanted to hear. It all started at a police station near Oxford, where an officer asked your name and recorded it. You spent a night in solitary confinement and then were sent to Campsfield Detention Center for your screening. The interview happened on your 3rd day there, and they handed you a document which said, among other things, that you were liable to be jailed for trying to mislead your interviewers. You were to have many more such interrogations at the Home Office and people's homes in the years to come. Some of those who befriended you asked at their dining tables about your reason for leaving your country, your surreptitious journey across Europe, and choosing the UK as your land of refuge. Perhaps they did so to make you a bit transparent and safe for themselves. The Home Office sent you to Liverpool, and you lived your first week in an asylum hostel where you penned the first words of Nassim's testament in a black-covered notebook. The poem was to become an elegy for a poet friend you had lost in Iran and your tribute to Liverpool. It became an offering to ingratiate you with a city hesitant about taking you in. You also drew your first exilic self-portrait there and inscribed it, a portrait of the artist as a young detainee. You thought you could understand Joyce, he wanted to be healed of Dublin, and you wanted to be healed of Shiraz. You had learned from him that a city which imperiled your growth could be nothing but paralysis, and you fled to leave your paralysis behind. In Shiraz, you had made many mirror self-portraits, especially in your prime, and what you did was more of an autoerotic ritual. As they say, after all, poets are always narcissi, but this time you would draw yourself often with dip pen and India ink for salvation. You needed to salvage yourself or what had remained of you for a remake. You were desperate to add facial features anew to a sandpapered countenance which had lost its features in a rough journey. You didn't have a name in the silence of the strange lands you passed through, and the windowless vessels that smuggled you denied you a face. In Britain, after every conversation about who you were and where you had come from, upon returning home, you confessed to yourself that you didn't tell your interlocutors this or that thing you either forgot or counted as uncomfortable or painful. And at night, your heart didn't let you sleep, asking you to draw or write something to release the shadows you had concealed from others into the open air. In other words, you would usually show your positive spaces to people, leaving your negative spaces to be seen in their solitude and yours. And during the night, when bleak pubs and sleeping churches became cutouts on their inky background, you could see what was left out from your morning stories. Alas, making self-portraits became a confessional act in which you tried to dismantle your facade or put aside your persona to catch glimpses of those living in your recesses. Those were times for your hand to give faithful renditions of things you saw and heard in your head. Who were you? A legion of shadows who were condensed to Nassim and Vahid, the two not-so-biographical protagonists of Nassim's testament, one depicting the friend you resurrected to be your fellow traveler in your odyssey, and the other representing a namesake who could speak for you and many other asylum seekers whose stories you had appropriated. And the person you were becoming was taking shape from Liverpool. You were a frequenter of art galleries welcomed by Marc Chagall at Tate in August 2013. A friend of the bridegroom in an evangelical house church warned not to recommend Bulgakov's Master and Margarita to anyone again. An early riser who would walk for an hour on the bank of the Mersey before sunrise to give ear to a lesbian celebrant of pagan festivals. An interpreter for migration solicitors who had to speak in first person for all clients, gays, apostates, and dissidents. A student in creative writing who was rewriting his right-to-left Persian poems in left-to-right English. An avid reader of mystic writings which emphasized the necessity of not being oneself as one could be one's own veil. A jester in fellow refugees' gatherings. A sober bookish man in the circles of serious people. And a lost child far from motherland. Your body was a shipping container for all your different selves, a whale's belly for their tails. One of your tales, the penultimate chapter of Nassim's testament, was fashioned after the biblical story of Jonah. One day, when browsing an online Persian dictionary to ascertain the meaning of some words in the poem, you encounter an unexpected Arabic word. The entry was Sombur, defined as both a sea and a sonless, brotherless man. The lexicon said nothing about the location of the sea, but it gave your imagination enough fodder to envisage a brotherless man at the bottom of a sea. You pictured Nassim, your alter ego, enshrined in the belly of a fish, and your heart whispered, Zunnun, the owner of the fish, one of Jonah's Quranic names. The huge fish was covered with stained glass scales and 4 windows which related the stories of 4 men who had either lost a son or a brother. You made yourself an equal of 3 fellow Iranian writers, not in stature, but in bereavement. In reality, they had lost men of their flesh, and you had lost a brother in arms. So you echoed Gilgamesh, calling your Enkidu, your brother, the axe you hung from your waist to secure a telltale window on the fish. And a time came to read that chapter with 2 other parts of the poem at an event in Scotland, and you wanted to take the opportunity to help the dream of illustrating the poem come true. Thus, you took the opening lines of Zunnun, or the owner of the fish, to create an image for your event's poster. You visited the Bell Pettigrew Museum to study their fishes. You chose a taxidermic Agriopus torvus and borrowed the outline of the enshrined priest from a Byzantine figure on a tiny Armenian triptych on your bookshelf. Did the priest need a face? You were tempted to find Nassim on Google Images and fill in the blanket with his eyes. But was the poem an unmixed account of his life to be enveloped in his looks? The poem had metamorphosed the man into a sphinx composed of Jonah, Jesus, Joseph, Alan Kurdi, and several other refugees. Now, his manifold faces had made him faceless. You remembered that Hafiz of Shiraz, the spirit of your homeland, was also a man with a face impossible to picture. From poem to poem, he was a shapeshifter, appearing as a Sufi, come Quran reciter, come agnostic, come wine drinker, come Gnostic in his divan. There was a wax museum in Shiraz where figures from all eras in the history of Fars province were arrayed, from Cyrus the Messiah and Barbad the musician to Abish Khatun the governess and Razavi Sarvestani the singer. Among all those names, only one was not represented by a statue. In the old brick building, the first time you passed by the 13th century Shirazi bard Sa'di, you held your breath, anticipating seeing Hafiz next. But under a vault, where the chronological order should have allotted a corner to his imaginary likeness, only a copy of his collected poems stood on a stool draped with a brocade. The book was there to conjure up the fluid face, almost like the flat touch of red paint, heading human bodies in impressionist paintings, which leaves the job of giving features to faces to the beholder's mind's eye. Perhaps this characteristic in the works of Monet and other painters of that generation fired Proust's imagination. In his Search of Lost Time, Proust's narrator, Marcel, is bewitched by the idea that a face can be seen for the first time after having been seen for many years. It is true that discovering freckles, noticing a small leaping muscle, or looking from a new angle can defamiliarize a familiar face. What are mirrors, expected or unexpected, if they are not windows to all the shadows you carry in yourself? What are they good for if they can't tell you that you do not know your face, let alone those of others? And what are windows if they are not see-through mirrors that allow you to see yourself through others' eyes? When your reflected image on a window pane is superimposed on passers-by on the other side and you find your face dark, doesn't it tell you that you have often projected your darkness on others? They say things which are repeated are significant. You have found your repeated act of drawing autoportraits worryingly significant. At first, it sounded like a good idea to put the portraits behind Noma's project's windows, as by doing so, you could have flung them into the outer world to get rid of them. The show was set up, and then you noticed the insistence of a behavior which could betray your intention. In the evenings, on your way back home, instead of going your habitual way from Overgate to Lawton Terrace, you often made your journey longer, going to Ward Road first to please yourself with your vanity. It was a dark evening the first time you did so, and you took a picture of each well-lit window to share with your close ones. At home, you looked at the photos in which the window panes were dotted with yellow lights of the Central Baptist Church on the other side of the road. It occurred to you then that the exhibition could be the church's shadow. And in an epiphanic moment, you saw your church hopper self, a shadow in many congregations you had joined. One day, you also noticed that the Baptist church had another shadow to its left a few doors away across the road. It is an old church converted to a music venue called church. At church's black entrance, congregation members may have seen the comings and goings of wild youngsters with unnatural hair colors and piercings. And some churchgoers may have remembered themselves in their good old dark days, atoning with their lips and desiring in their hearts. You have asked yourself what Jesus would have done with his shadow of his bride. Would he go to church to dance with a shadow, as he is depicted dancing to Venus's harp in a Hafiz ghazal? Would he allow his apostles to exhibit pictures of his whirling dance at Noma's, accompanied by Luke 12:2? There is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known. What would Hafiz do had he been asked to be the next Noma's artist after Christ? Would he lend his wine-stained Quran and prayer mat to be displayed behind the windows, bearing vinyl verses against hypocrisy? You think they both would. Hafiz says in a ghazal, bring wine. Quran reciters, clerics, sheikhs, religious spies, look well at each of them and see a man who lives by lies. You wish you had composed something as telling to be printed on the windows of the owner of the fish, the show that belies you. You wish you were not a hypocrite. Thank you.
Thank you, Vahid. Well, almost brought a tear to my eye there at the end, Vahid. I'm glad you stopped when you did. Yeah, thanks very much, Vahid.
It was a pleasure.
We'll keep that image there at the moment. I love how the process, everything that led up to even asking you to show at NOMAS for me was getting to know you and hearing your story, and the fact that having this experience has also been part of your story. The way you've shared that, even just the recognition of, well, what am I doing? When you said you would walk past the windows, just to see, just to see your work in the windows and the vanity of that. Or even just all the questions that it's raised about what does it mean to do this, which of course I think a lot of artists do that. I know I found myself doing that as well. So I really appreciate you sharing that and your honesty. When you were talking as well, Vahid, I did think, I wonder what version of Vahid that we're getting, like as in NOMAS projects, what have I got? Because certainly my experience of you, Vahid, is of like just such a gentle, considered, thoughtful person. And, I've often gone away thinking, I would like to be a bit more like that, listen more, be more considered before I speak. And I'm convinced that is actually really who you are as well, Vahid, even if there's other things there that are disguised, as we all do. Anyway, I'm going to not say any more and just open it up for questions. There's no questions in the chat yet. But it could be any questions, it could be related to what Vahid shared, could be related to his drawings, maybe even his technique. That's something I'm interested in as well. Where did you learn to draw like that? So yeah, any questions? And if people, you can put it in the chat if you don't want to open up, but it's a comfortable enough group, I think, if anyone wants to just unmute and raise your hand and ask, feel free. Yes, Rebecca.
Hiya. Hi, everyone. Hi, Vahid. I was just wondering if you can identify yourself switching between registers as you move between poetry, prose poetry, and illustration. Even, that's beyond even talking about whether you're writing in English or Persian, but even just between those different forms, do you notice yourself shifting registers or identities?
That's a very good question, Rebecca. At least when I'm writing in English, I really don't produce poetry in English because this language hasn't become the language of my soul as yet. Quite recently, I penned my very first English poem, which was a prose poem that I contributed to the pamphlet that you are putting together. And yes, I think because I really think of the translatability of my writings when I write in Persian and sometimes when I write in English, that really affects who I am, how I want to make myself opaque sometimes and at other times transparent for my audience in the two languages. And it's basically, particularly when I am writing poetry, it's all about the personas that I wear. I never speak without a persona when I'm writing. So yes, I really change persona when I'm producing poetry. Mm-hmm.
Rebecca also was asking about the different registers between writing and visual. as well. I can't remember exactly how you worded that, Rebecca, but
yeah, that was it. Also, if you can discern different registers that you move between, whether you're working in text and then illustration, even.
So when it comes to illustration and when it comes to pictorial arts, I really don't know what a register means in that realm. Well, that has been my hobby for many years. I mean, drawing and painting. And it hasn't been something that I have given much thought, at least as much as that I have thought about my writings. But well, if you can explicate what you just said about registers, you may help me give you a better answer.
Yeah, I'm thinking of register perhaps in terms of where the work is coming from in you. So if you're intentionally writing text, whether it's poem or prose, and whether it's in Persian or English, but then when you're shifting into illustration or visual art, does it shift inside of you where that is coming from, where you're drawing from in yourself to produce something in illustration compared to something in text? Does that shift inside of you that you've noticed?
Yes, I've noticed that shift. But basically, I draw and paint in over the past few years. I have only been drawing, not painting. But that normally happens when I have barren periods as a poet, and then I need to create something to create a hole in the rock that is facing me and blocking me from writing. And yes, in at least in such moments, it becomes something that takes place in my moments of silence, because when I'm writing, these multitudes of selves start dialoguing and quarreling in me, and I listen to them. Whereas, something very interesting that I have told some of my friends, including Aya, or I don't know, I may have told my other friends as well, that in Persian, in Zoroastrianism, the messenger of God, Soroush, the name for this the word for this messenger of God is basically the word from which the word for poetry or even song derives. So one of the Persian words for poetry is surud, or for song. And that means that the poet is someone who is able to listen. And another meaning of that name is obedience. It has to do with to obey. So a poet is someone who listens and obeys. And when I am writing poetry, I become that obedient listener. Whereas when I am, for example, doing self-portraits, in silence, I stare at myself and try to be a good, faithful translator, rendering what I'm seeing before my mind's eye. And I think one similarity between these two realms is that in both cases, I want to be a faithful translation of what I'm seeing or what I'm hearing in my head. So both are acts of translation, if you like.
That was a great answer, Vahid. The question just from Patrick, he's asking, is it always poetry first? Now, you may have given some kind of clues or indicators in what you've just answered there, but yeah, that's the question. Is it always poetry first? You talked about having a block, perhaps, and that's when you might move into doing, a different form of creativity. But would you always write first?
It's not just about painting or drawing. Compared to everything else in my life, poetry is what comes first. And as I said, drawing is just the key to open the padlock or create a hole in the rock that blocks my way to poetry. Yes. So my answer is yes.
Yes. Thanks, Vahid. A question here from Heather. As an intermedialist, and that's Heather studying master's in that subject, she says, I understand flowing with both poetry and visual art. Has the artist considered making artworks with both visual and calligraphy on it simultaneously? For example, like Chinese pictures with poetry on the visual art, or Leporello and other artist book formats?
That has been an idea. Thank you so much for this question. That has been an idea that I have been toying with for a while, because, for example, in the case of Nassim's Testament, my drawings followed the poem. When I composed and completed a poem, then I started illustrating it. And now I am actually toying with the idea of creating poetry and illustration at the same time. And I would like my drawings to take the lead and for my poetry to follow when the drawings impose themselves, if you like. That's one of my next projects, one of my post-PhD projects. Once I have disentangled my extremities from this mammoth project.
Yeah. It's just worth acknowledging that Vahid has taken on this project for NOMAS at the closing stages of his PhD as well. So that's incredible that he's taken this on board with all that going on as well. One of the things I remember asking you, Vahid, quite early on in our chat, once I'd seen the drawings, and we talked about how they, you had the first one that you drew, portrait of the portrait of the artist as an yeah, that one, and how then the portraits then became not, I mean, you talked about it, the kind of narcissism as well, but that actually this was part of the journey, which was what led us to the decision about how can we incorporate the story, the journey, Nassim's testimony with these visuals, because both of them are telling your journey, your story. And what I asked you was that poetry, there are certain art forms that are more accessible just more accessible than others, and poetry is often seen as a harder to access, well, maybe arguably a harder to access art form. And what is it that if you're especially because you're really trying to share this story, that you're choosing to do it in poetic language, where maybe less people would experience it?
Well, what I can say is that, as I said in my soliloquy, the two things happened at the same time. I mean, in my very first week in that asylum hostel, I both started penning some lines or words that came to my mind and drawing myself. I think I was at a stage that I really needed to read everything and interpret the surrounding world for myself. And I, as an individual, was part of that world. In the new milieu, in the new context, I had become somebody else. And it was not just drawing self-portraits. I tried to kind of decipher Liverpool for myself, because at the beginning it was such a frightening city to live in, with its emblems, for example, the liver bird, the frowning bird, and the super lamb bananas, and the portraits of the Beatles everywhere, as if they were all sphinxes asking me questions. And I needed to answer those questions. So I started reading the city, reading myself. And during that period, I really became dumb, and I couldn't speak, and I couldn't really render things that I heard in my head. So drawing came to my rescue, and in a way to tell the people who were in my surroundings that I am someone, actually to add facial features, and as I said, other legible lines to my silhouette. I produced those drawings or illustrations and presented to others, normally the Brits, for them to part read me from those illustrations or drawings or paintings. Yeah. But was what I said the answer of your question, or no?
Yes. Yeah. No. Vahid, there's 3 other questions here, so I'm going to ask them now. Time-wise, just so that you know, folks, we'll probably take these 3 questions, and then I'm going to hand over to Owen, who is just going to let us know what else is coming up with Noma's projects in the coming weeks and months. So next question, Vahid, is from Emmett, and he says, really interesting, brilliant to see your work again. When creating self-portraits, do you make the conscious decision to depict yourself in a certain way, or do you feel this is a more subconscious reflection of your life and emotions?
So thank you, Emmett. What I can say is that, again, it's just about translation and translating. I see something before my mind's eye, and I try to render it as faithfully as I can. And perhaps where I have failed, it is only because my right hand is not married very well to my heart or to my mind. So basically, yes, I make that decision before sitting in front of a mirror. And that's like the decision a translator makes when he or she decides to translate something. Although I need to say that when a translator decides to translate something, that translator, holds the author in great respect, okay? He or she chooses, somebody who is, say, a giant for he or she, okay? In that case, I'm not that translator, because I am my own worst enemy. Mm-hmm. And I try to undermine myself in what I draw, sometimes what I write. That's the difference between me as a translator and those who translate other people's works.
Vahid, can I just come in on that question in terms of, or that answer in terms of your drawing technique, and where you learnt that? And I'm asking this in the sense of if you had a certain training of how to look and how to represent what you're looking at, even if it was even if you're doing a drawing of a statue, that you're translating that, but you've been given certain techniques of how to render with pen and ink and how to look and so on, that that would then affect your translation as well. Even the fact that you're choosing to draw in thicker pencil sometimes pen and ink, sometimes with tone, and so on. So when you're drawing yourself, as much as you're kind of questioning whether you're undermining yourself, are you still trying to, or are aware of your ability, your technical ability, that you're capturing what's seen in front of you? So if you were if you were sad that day, that you would capture sadness because you've technically captured that well?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. So I learned drawing and painting in Shiraz art school when I was a teenager, and I worked with different materials. During these years, I have never had really a studio or, a place on my own that I can call a home. I have lived in many houses without having lived in a home. And because of the limitations because of the limitations those places imposed on me, it was quite impossible to experiment with certain materials that I used to work with in Iran. For example, oil. One of the simplest things that I had at my disposal was ink and dip pen. And as an itinerant draftsman, I could carry them with me wherever I went. For example, I went to Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool and spent hours and hours in their, statues gallery. And then it became, my sword. It became my weapon and the only thing that I used in all my battles with myself.
Yeah. There's a couple of good questions. I'm going to just leave your question at the moment, Owen, if that's okay, and just take the other people's. This one from Shona. Thank you for the talk. As we know, you are from Shiraz, the city of poetry. I was wondering how your inspiration for your poems has shifted from Shiraz as you came to different places. Where do you get your inspiration in St Andrews and Dundee? And how did this change your poems and art? And that might just tie in with the question. I don't know the gentleman's name, but it has DMB23, who's just said, reading the cities can be hard text to read. Were you reading a personal one, or did you have the chance to listen to local people's stories, memories, and readings of their city? So that maybe ties in terms of inspiration and where you find inspiration, and how you read text. Does it come from just looking the city or from other people's stories as well?
So that was several questions in one question.
It was indeed, Vahid. I think focus on the inspiration in terms of how
you added some addenda to Shona's question. I need to say that when I went to Liverpool, first time I saw daffodils and narcissi and pansies, it was like, running into blood relatives, because my city is well known for its narcissi and its pansies. And that really, after a while, helped me feel at home. And later, reading Adrian Henry, I learned that Liverpool was like my hometown, Shiraz, the city of poets. And jokingly, Adrian Henry said, come with me to any pub or cafe. We drink wine, and then we throw the bottle in any direction, and no doubt it will glance off a poet's head. Liverpool was really such a city. That was the biggest similarity it had with my hometown. I started, frequenting cafes and pubs, and everywhere I met poets. So that was one of the things that inspired me. And as I said, I started reading the city for myself, and that's why Liverpool is so big in Nassim's Testament. There is hardly any mention of Shiraz, my hometown, in the poem, whereas Liverpool, it's just looms large in the poem. And another thing that happened during these years was that I became a full-time reader of sacred texts. So in these years, I read the Bible, the Christian Bible, the Quran, the Avesta, the sacred text of Zoroastrianism, word by word and from cover to cover. And quite recently, I have embarked on a very interesting project, which is Ginzaraba, the sacred book of Mandaians, who are followers of John the Baptist, a very small minority in Iran and Iraq. So I'm reading this very interesting book wherein Zoroastrianism and Judaism meet. That's a book I recommend to everyone, because I know it's translated into English. And that has been one of the well springs of inspiration for me during these years. I mean, reading sacred texts.
Yeah. Thanks, Vahid. I think that answers your question, David, actually, in terms of the inspiration, particularly from Liverpool. Just going back to Shona's question about where do you get the inspiration in St Andrews and Dundee, and I hope that's not meant. I hope that's not meant like, where on earth would you get inspiration in St Andrews and Dundee? I don't think it is. Yeah. So how has Dundee and St Andrews inspired you, Vahid?
In St Andrews, because I never found the town real enough for it to become a source of inspiration. Mm-hmm. I think during the 2 years that I lived in St Andrews, the wellspring of inspiration for me were the sacred texts that I was reading. And in Dundee, because it's just Liverpool's sister, again, I think I'm a fish in my own waters. And it's really a shame that I haven't had time to explore the city well, because I commute every day between St Andrews and Dundee. But I'm sure if I spend a while after this PhD in Dundee, there is a lot in the city to respond to as a poet. And the main thing is the Tay, because many times it has quickened my imagination, but the PhD doesn't let me be a good listener, and an obedient poet, because I would like to suspend everything else and just write and just sit and write.
Yeah. If you're looking for inspiration in Dundee from a poet, of course you've got McGonagall. I'm only kidding. I see Beth shaking her head. That's to inspire you not to write like that. I'm aware a few people have had to leave, and if anyone else has to leave, just because there's another couple of questions, and I'm really enjoying hearing Vahid's answers, and so I think I'm going to ask these next two questions before I hand over to you, Owen. And obviously, if people have to leave, feel free to. But we'll take these last two questions, and please don't anyone else ask a question, because I'll be tempted to keep going. So this one's from Robin Vahid, and he was just following on from the question of Rebecca, what Rebecca mentioned about register, and the different shifts he's noticed in Nassim's testament. I was wondering if you ever drawn a portrait of your friend Nassimi. Your identity. Well, sorry, it's just written like that.
I can ask it if you want, Cully. Is it okay if I jump in? I won't take long. I'm sorry it took me so long to join, Vahid. Thanks to Aya and Alex for helping, Alex inadvertently. I was actually wondering, because it seems to me that the self-portraits are very much about self-exploration in some ways, aren't they? And in the poem, the impression I get is that one of the ways in which you explore your own identity and situation and everything is through the relationship with Nassimi, you know, that in some ways you're almost kind of doubles, aren't you? And I was wondering whether you'd actually ever drawn a portrait of him, and if so, how it compares to your portraits of yourself. I mean, it's a slightly kind of left field question in a way, but I was just wondering about that.
Thank
I've
you.
asked you so many obvious questions.
Yeah, I think
well, although you are very well known in Fife and in Angus, for those who don't know you, I just would like to say that Robin is my publisher, and I was really honored to have my first pamphlet, my first publication in English. It was published by Robin, by Metexnik, his press in Kupa. A few times I tried to draw portraits of him. It was not in Iran. I mean, after my migration. And because I couldn't find him on Google Images, I tried to just picture him and draw him. And there is a portrait of him that I produced just from imagination in the manuscript of Nassim's Testament that I can show you one day. But apart from that, because during the time that I was penning Nassim's Testament, I imagined Nassim's in all these different situations, in the lights sacred texts, mainly the Christian Bible, shed on him. So his face was amalgamated with faces of Jesus, Jonah, Joseph, and others. And it really became impossible to depict him. After that, I found some of his pictures on the social media, but because I thought that I was done with the job, I really forwent depicting him because I was afraid of betraying the portraiture that I had produced in Nassim's Testament. If I drew him, I don't know if that makes sense.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, that was a great question, Robin. Thank you. Well, last question, Vahid, from your friend Aya. I enjoyed very much your self-address. If nothing else mattered, except your internal voice, which is perhaps what life is all about, an inner unfolding that happens separate from or as reaction to external circumstance. My question is, you mentioned that you sometimes undermine yourself. Is there a conscious reason why?
So let me find Aya's question first.
Third to last.
Well, yeah, Aya, thank you so much. I'm a huge fan of Hafiz of Shiraz. And in many of his ghazals, the poet or the speaker in the poem undermines himself. I think he's very afraid of his ego. And he's always busy taking his ego down. So, yeah, as far as I know, because there might be things my unconscious that I'm not aware of, but as far as I do it consciously, that's my warfare against my ego.
Thank you, Vahid.
Thank you, Vahid.
One of the things we learn from Rembrandt, of course, is that he painted what he saw, and you see him aging almost in front of you with each of his honest portrayals of himself.
I remember that in The Wasteland, Eliot addresses the hypocrite reader, but I prefer to address the hypocrite author.
There's so much more conversation we could have, but we just time-wise, we need to wrap it up. I'm going to hand over to Owen just to let you know what else is happening with No Mass. So just another 5 minutes of your time, and then we'll thank Vahid for his time.
Okay, I wanted to just share with everybody. We've seen parts of Vahid's work, and also want to put a personal apology to Vahid. The notion of translation was really important in your sense of persona, sense of experience, and then, of course, when it came to cutting vinyl, my fonts did not translate what you had given me when I put it into the thing. Plus, with work commitments, it was slow in getting the repairs made to your poem in vinyl, so I wanted to apologise personally in public to this poet from Iran. So here are some install shots. For those of you who are visiting from the States or online from Zoom, here is in context in Ward Road and Dundee. And we can see a beautiful pencil drawing of the fish on the right-hand side and snippets of the show in the other windows. And as we go through, my resolution is not great on here either, but you can see the number of portraits and my poorly cut vinyl, which caused me a bit of soul searching to try and work out what was going wrong. But here we have the show as we presented it. And the drawings are indescribably delicate. And for this to be Vahid's hobby makes me very jealous because I cannot get close to that level of drawing. And so here we have some more, perhaps up close and better resolution versions. So for us, a tremendous honour that we should be able to participate in your work in a small way, and especially given the fact that you're doing this at the tail end of your doctorate. You can see the fish here, maybe large. Okay. Now, something that really struck me was this notion of re-identifying, having to be treated like a criminal almost, and reintroducing and reinventing yourself, and which role would you be? And I just found that a very moving statement. The whole artist statement's on the No Mass site, but that aspect of the work really, really struck me. And when you gave your soliloquy, we have this coming through again and again and again and then sitting reading multiple sacred texts and coming from Iran, this kind of cradle of civilization, and poetry being used as a form of resistance towards different cultures, where Iran was able to preserve itself through its own myths and beautiful stories that are part of the national heart and identity of Iran. I see what you're doing as a kind of miniature embodiment of that whole Persian psyche or Iranian psyche, but then being confronted with all the kind of fractures of globalization and society, and then having to, who are you? Who exactly are you? And who can you prove yourself to be? And this is a trendy theme academically, but I reread this really nice article by John Potts, 2012, talking about globalization and displacement. And now when I've seen your work and I read these academic texts, I feel quite heartbroken or upset by them, because it's done in a theoretical way so often in contemporary art. But what your work resonates with is the idea of having to do this for survival and having to do this to understand who you are, and the multiple mirrors. And so when it's spoken of theoretically, a modernity of globalized and decentralized negotiations of multiple discussions from different cultures, polyglot immigrant, exiled tourist, the flaneur, the urban wanderer, the figures of contemporary culture, almost in a kind of naive abstraction, and yet you're having to do that in a brutal way through hard experience. And I feel somehow the art world, in a way, has missed that conversation at some level. And of course, all these kind of global themes I felt, and some I haven't got it clear in my head, but this idea of translation of ideas and representation of yourself is there, but the way it's treated is very sterile in the kind of theoretical way, and yet how you presented these in your soliloquy was much more heartfelt about the hard edges of this at a personal level. So it's still kind of trying to get clear in my own mind, but I wish we had more time to think about it a little bit more. And then this quote I've had on at the end of each of our talks. But the work of art offers the possibility to come to terms with grief, shame, and fear, can acknowledge and accept excess, and shows the differences that can exist, you know. And I feel that the way that Vahid has navigated all of these complex things personally and globally has been very poignant for us. So we just want to give you massive thanks for taking the time and taking the risk to show your work at NOMA. So we greatly appreciate it.